Failure allows time to reflect on what is or is not going well.
Matt, thank you for being here. We know each other from your work at Arena Labs, but you've obviously, served our country a great deal as a SEAL instiller involved in the reserves. I would love to just start off with, you're constantly thinking about the world of performance and the work you do now and continuing to coach people that are high performers, but taking it back to perhaps, your story and how you went into a world of service. Could you walk me through maybe a situation where you particularly, or a story where you realize the importance of what we call performance or the importance of building capacity and how that kind of showed up? It could be a failure or like an older story and training when that became evident, the importance to you.
Yeah, I have plenty of stories of failure. But I think my decision to join the Navy was motivated, like a lot of service members, of just wanting to give back, the country, and having seen prior generations do it, it just felt like it was a natural, extension to go into. What came from the performance side was this sort of, I think, this anxiety and this fear of not being able to pull my weight. And so even for making that decision to enlist in the Navy and setting that trajectory of physical performance, it was all kind of motivated by this desire to not be the liability on the team. And a lot of that kind of stems admittedly from insecurity early on. But I think as you kind of move through that and you kind of realize your strengths and your weaknesses, you start to understand that your skills and your strengths can give back to other people as well. That was largely the driving factor, kind of why I care so passionately about performance, right? It's not necessarily for the individual's success, and that's a nice byproduct, I suppose, but it's more importantly, I think, to be able to have the bandwidth to give back to other people. And then as far as failures, what I think is interesting is we come up with these models and these protocols that work for us, and we stick to them pretty definitively. Like, we found the solution. But in my case, right, I feel like I found the solution. It was it was arrive earlier. It was stay later. It was work harder. It was sleep less. It was all these things that from performance side was not valuable, but it had worked for me to a point. And this is early on in my career in the military. And then at some point I kind of shifted gears and was pursuing other avenues, and that method didn't work anymore. In fact, it kind of largely backfired, and it was a pretty catastrophic failure. Just personally, I think I put a lot of weight into my ability to do things, and then to have this failure kind of come crashing down on me was this earth-shattering experience. That being said, though, I wouldn't change anything about it. I wouldn't go back and choose success, because I know this is a cliche, but it's obviously true. There's more to learn in failure than there is from successes. And so I know we all know people and super high performers, especially in the military, who are just constantly succeeding. Seems like everything they touch turns to gold. I was not that guy. I was fortunate to make it through these programs cleanly, right? Like first try, aside from the failure. But I feel like I was always on the skin of my teeth. And failure allows time to reflect on what is or is not going well. And so I almost have maybe a sympathy for folks who are just constantly succeeding in life. I think it almost becomes detrimental in the long term.
And so on that note, that story is really interesting in the context of healthcare, because a lot of people, will have those moments where those can be kind of the wake up calls. But could you walk through, like, in that failure moment, it seems like that was the point where there was a nexus and kind of a mind shift. What were the things you were feeling when it happened?
And so my wife was pregnant with our second daughter, and right when you have kids, you kind of try to control everything in life. You try to have all your ducks in a row. You have your timeline set ahead. This is what life's going to look like. This is where we're going to live. This is yada, yada, yada. And so when this dramatic failure occurs, everything falls apart. Like, what am I going to do now? And so what that kind of emotionally felt like can't really explain why, but I mean, it was, I wasn't sleeping, right? I'd wake up in the middle of the night angry. The only way I would offset that is whatever I was doing, if I woke up, I would get up and I would go either run or swim.
Wow.
I don't recommend that as like a healthy outlet, but it's just how I handled it. Thinking ahead, I was probably spiraling even faster, but that's how I handled that. Um, it was kind of an identity crisis. I think when you're in these worlds where, especially for medicine, right, these high performance fields of medicine, our egos get involved. We start to associate our successes to our lifestyle, and we're very reluctant to have these kind of knocks on our record because you know that there's other folks who are kind of vying for those positions, and so I think we put undue stress on ourselves, um, to be just perfect all the time. But yeah, that failure eventually, when I started thinking about the lessons, when I stopped thinking about me and started thinking about the blessings that it led to, right? I got to be home more for my wife and my pregnant wife and our oldest daughter, and then got to be around for my second daughter's birth, and then because I was home more, my wife would hate me saying this, but right, she was pregnant again, and we we had another baby, and so there's just so many good things that
Yeah.
come from
Yeah.
this one thing that I thought was just life altering.
And when you had the switch, or like you had that moment of reflection over the course, what were some of the things you started to change?
I At the time, I don't think I could have defined it this way, but looking back, probably having focusing on emotional health, recognizing, having gratitude that you get these snapshots in time as a father or as a husband with your kids, and it moves so fast. And had I been successful, I would have been set on this track that just accelerated everything. I'd probably still be there today. And aside from one of my kids probably not being here, I would look back and say, like, how did I miss 8 years? My daughter's gonna be 8 on Saturday. How did I miss 5 of those years already? And so I think just having that moment, that reflection, and that gratitude for, yes, there's a failure, right? Let's acknowledge what it is. It's not ideal. I wish it didn't happen. That being said, what good came from it? And then when you kind of stack those two together, you can see that there may be more benefit to having failed,
Yeah.
than having succeeded.
In that story, now kind of merging your two worlds. So you've, at this point, coached upwards of hundreds nurses and or doctors at this point. And so, there's a lot of, when I hear that, and also trying to tie it into some of the work we now currently do and serving that population, there's that common thread of those stressors of like the home and work balance, which I'm sensing kind of from that story.
Yeah.
When you are working with that surgeon who's having the same issue of almost you can sometimes see it in their conversations where they quite literally will go crush a run or something if there's a trauma or they're having that trouble. What's a few tools that you almost immediately recommend to a nurse or doctor that are particularly trying to do the balance between work and home?
I was thinking about this question not long ago, as far as how do you convince a hard charging individual to stop? Because I think some people are reluctant to say how much they love the chaos. And I think this especially applies to healthcare providers. You get in a routine of the irregularity, of the midnight calls, the rushing into work, the trauma, and I think I think our bodies just kind of, as a defense mechanism, create a comfortability with that, and so, which leads to those folks, kind of me included, almost preferring those environments more than our home life because it's so opposite. And so how do you elevate the one that's going to be there in the long run, right, versus the career? I think that's maybe a way to rephrase the question. I don't want to jump right into maybe like the solutions, but I'm convinced that sleep is the soul clarifying thing to all of this. That's also the hardest one to convince people to, I don't say give up, but to advocate for. But that pause half of the day has a clarifying effect on the brain. And the way I've kind of always personally experienced this, but try to communicate it as is with poor sleep habits, there's sort of this film or this kind of cataracts maybe over the brain. And so you can still see what's going on in your world, but you just don't see it clearly. You can still react to things, but you don't react to it the most effectively. And so folks who are kind of riding that burnout train, I do remember working with a clinician who was super brilliant. I mean, everything she touched was just like, triathlete, surgeon, mother. Like this, wow, what am I doing, right? Communicating with her. What help? What can she give me? Because
exactly.
she was so smart. But her biometrics were not good, and I remember we fortunately had that connection over. This is her coping mechanism, and so I hate being the coach who's doom and gloom, but interjecting some truth into the reality of that lifestyle, I think does help a little bit. And just recognizing that Mother Nature is going to call to collect at some point. And so you want to run this system on red. Okay, you can do that, but something's going to give. And, now is kind of that time to, while you still have some custody and control of your life, to maybe make choices to kind of take the reins back.
That's well said. There was a phrase we came across as like, it's a classic. If you don't give your body rest, your body will find a way to do it. And it is the quote unquote crashing point in many ways of many of those stories. On that note, you mentioned biometrics, but for someone who's not had, a wearable or has an understanding, a lot of your work focuses on the awareness and also understanding the control of physiology. We were talking about this right before. How have biometrics been helpful for you, and how would you explain, why even view it in the first point, or answer that question to a nurse or doctor?
Yeah, so maybe argue against it early on. I remember when I was kind of in the thick of being in the Navy, they would offer us all these sort of resources, these human performance resources. And so Whoop straps were kind of new at the time, and they gave them to us. And I remember putting it on, and I remember constantly being in the red. And it got to the point where I was almost frustrated that I ended up taking it off. Like I don't have the luxury of fixing my situation. So I'd rather not be told first thing when I wake up that I'm not ready for the day. It had this kind of opposite effect. So I remember just throwing in the corner. This is ridiculous. But like we mentioned earlier, right? Father Time or Mother Nature is going to call to collect at some point. And what I think biometrics provide is a floor. And there's a lot of conversations we've had as when I was a coach with people who you could see them just spiraling, and they just continued to. I remember I brought you guys attention, like this one seems a little bit different.
Yeah.
There's something going on here. There's more. And I think at least having that floor of alarm bells going off, right? That quote unquote, that Whoop strap saying you're in the red, that's one of those alarm bells. Irritability with your spouse, kids, or at work, that's an alarm bell. And obviously there's no biometric, associated with that, but you start to just see these things pop up. And the more things you have pop up in your face that say something's not correct, I think allows you to pull that emergency brake and hopefully fix the situation.
Yeah. And you can, I'd love to, for that case example you mentioned, you keep it anonymous, but for, the nurse or doctor listening to this that's saying, oh, what are those things that are in the spiral, or what are the things that show up? What was it in that case?
A general discontent with life. And from Marina's perspective, right, it was trying to give resources. From a coaching perspective, it was trying to give resources to this nurse to kind of swing things in the direction. But I remember the conversations that she and I were having were more about feeling disrespected in the workplace, feeling fatigued, not listened to, and then it kind of unravels into her parents are not doing well and spouse isn't right. And so you could see all these things just kind of come crashing down. I certainly had a great deal of sympathy for her because of that. And it's tough to communicate with folks in that position, just to say you need a good night's sleep. and I don't want to oversimplify emotional challenges as a good night's sleep, but I really do think there's something there, right? At least it's that pause button of just, okay, if that didn't work, then maybe we pursue kind of other avenues. But kind of folks who are feeling like they are in a spiral need to find a way to cut away the problem, right? The anecdote of parachuting, or you have your main, you have your reserve. If that main is not operating correctly, it needs to leave. And if you deploy that reserve underneath that main parachute, you may have a bigger problem, right? So you have to, at some point, learn how to remove some things from your life so that maybe other things can flourish. I guess maybe you were the one that said this, I don't know, but like a rose garden, right? Or maybe this is just a classic anecdote, but in order for sunlight to allow those roses to grow, like the thorns have to be cleared away. Yeah. And I think sometimes people's lives and the careers and their relationships hopefully are not thorn bushes, but they may be. Yeah. And taking some time to identify whether it's a flower or a thorn, I think is valuable.
Yeah.
So you know kind of how to best cultivate it.
I love that. And even in the point of sleep, you're, bringing it back to what you said about like the emotional regulation and realizing, to your point of like, there's so much angst in this one case example. And, you said, even though it's simple, a good night of sleep, but it is funny how much there's a well-known understanding of the benefits of sleep and like REM per se, which you get on the later half stages of your sleep. And one of the, best ways to get more is to sleep in, which is often a thing you don't have, but that is your body's way of kind of therapy in a way to simplify it down. It's like the stage where you have your dreams. A lot of the things that are the processes that go on in that stage are to emotionally regulate and help with that. And I know you've always mentioned, and even like the importance of sleep, which I think this is really keen, is like you as a coach can even recognize it without a sensor I remember when we first met, you said like people coming to the gym, when you're understanding, like what I find really important is you said, if I remember, it was like, I can just see in the eyes, or like the way they're looking at me, or the maybe not looking as much, or the fuse is a bit shorter that day. And I think that was really important in the context of like, when you take a person like that and you put it in a high stress environment, like medicine, like an OR or an ED or an ICU, or in your previous life, that becomes a lot more kind of, all of a sudden, a lot more of a volatile environment, because you have that already going to you, where you're not like doing another field where you're just lounging on the couch all day. So but you're doing something really intense, and you've compromised. I'm curious, kind of building off that, what do you feel like, from your previous line of work, what do you think healthcare can learn from what SEALs have thought about in terms of team and performance?
There is a integrity that occurs within these units that is strong, for lack of a better word. Having kind of transitioned out of active duty, my wife and I talk often about how much we miss that life. And one thing that we kind of, maybe a reason we came up with it was, when you meet people in this lifestyle, not lifestyle, but right, the military, 60% of your story is the exact same. And that allows you to kind of get to the meat of depth and connection with other people, because you have so much of the same story. And so I think from a team building aspect in healthcare, I'm not a huge fan of maybe like open communication in circles, right? But I think there's a certain degree of transparency that needs to occur of experience. And my wife's a nurse, and so for play stories, horror stories about kind of how stressful ORs can be. And I think it's important to recognize that everyone is bringing something to the table. And while, yes, there are certain players in the medical space who are maybe making like the key decisions or the key actions or the key cuts, those decisions cannot occur without other people in the room doing their best work. And so I think when you're in these team environments, everyone needs to be firing on all cylinders. And the best way to understand that connection with someone is to know where they come from. And so from a team building, I think that's, something that I reflect as a useful method. From performance, it's tough because the Navy provided a lot of resources to us to be successful. I remember early on we had like a human performance coach come and talk to us about sleep. And the answer was, hey, you guys are about to enter into a world where this is a bit of a luxury. And so take these micro naps as you go along. And we're like, it's interesting, but sure. You're in a 15-minute car ride or helicopter or whatever, like just take a nap. And actually, a friend of mine asked me just last week, she read an article or saw a headline, I should say, like the Navy SEAL trick to like a power nap or something like this. And she's like, well, what's the secret? Why do you do that? And I was like, oh, no, there's no secret. You're just so fatigued that when you have a break, you just crash. Yeah. There's no thing you put yourself into. You're just so tired that it happens. And so when I say that about performance, I think there's kind of a cultural disconnect where there's extraordinarily high expectations that the culture places, that the country places, that the individual places on themselves. Performance in a lot of ways like goes the other direction, right? Because then you look at the professional athletes, they get their sleep, they get the food, they get the
green smoothies.
That's right, the green smoothies. And right in the healthcare space or the first responder space is kind of over here. We're like, yeah, these are all nice to haves. And so I think without encouraging this demographic of military, first responders, medicine to just go full bore into like, well, I'm an athlete, and there's some value in training that way, but it can come at a cost. What things can we come to the middle on? And to return to it, I'm going to sound like I'm belaboring the point, but the sleep, right, that has the most bang for the buck. And so I think there's just ways to look over at the high performing athletic crowd and say, look, I can't do all of those things, but let's pick maybe one and see how that goes.
And then for sleep, if you were to, really simply put, in kind of steps, what you would advise them to do, what would it be?
The cool, dark, and quiet.
Yeah.
So I like stress, going back to that chaos. I don't know what I would do. My wife she can advocate for this. I cannot sit still for very long. And I know a lot of people are similar to that. But that stress is reserved for the daylight hours. Right. I know this is, again, a luxury versus medicine and some first responder and military. But let's just say in my case right now, I have the luxury of stress during the day. That when it's off at night. And so to, again, oversimplify this complicated conversation, from a development standpoint, when the sun went down, there's nothing to do, right? It's dark outside. You can just kind of huddle in and just hope you don't get eaten by whatever's out there. But I think that assuming that kind of you're in that safe space, the brain has that opportunity to kind of cleanse itself throughout the day, so that when you go back into that stress at the sun up, you do need to have that exposure as well, right? We see a lot of societal challenges because of lack of stress or eustress, right? In today's youth. I don't know if I'm old enough to say that yet, but so I think it's important to understand the difference between the on switch and the off switch.
I'm curious, in the context of teams in healthcare, you mentioned this, kind of going back to the original question, but also sleep, like this is important. But the reason a team is also so important is people can hold each other accountable to do those things. And what you're describing, the SEALs provided was a lot of the performance to at least start the conversation of like, these are the tools you can do, even if it's just starting the conversation. It's pretty profound to just have that, where in many others, there's probably not even this discussion or a comfort in being able to talk about it. But if you were to, if I was to just drop you in an ICU or ER today, how would you go about, what's some of the first things you would do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will try to listen for how people are communicating. You obviously have a traumatic situation, right, in an ER or ICU case, or even not, right? Even if it's pretty standard surgery, ultimately there's something important occurring in front of everybody. But communicating in a short, when I say short, I mean kind of rude, right? Efficiency is one thing. Curtness is another. Right? If you're the fly on the wall, looking for eye rolls behind the mask, right? Receiving instructions and then watching how people react to that, I think is probably what I would try to identify first. That's going to happen naturally, I think, as the surgery continues. People get fatigued. But maybe let's take that as an example, right? If the surgery is a 7, 8, 9 hour long surgery, you're going to expect that sort of snappiness between, the nurses and healthcare team. But if it's occurring in the first 9 minutes of a surgery, right, something else is going on there. And so from a team building aspect, you kind of want to take that moment in time and say, hey, what are the deficiencies? Is it people not keeping up with the surgical demands? Is it the surgeon driving the pacing too fast for the nursing staff or the OR staff? And so just taking communication snapshots, I think, would be the simplest version to look for.
And so how would you, on that kind of case example, advise accordingly for the early signs of curtness? And like, what do you feel like is the communication is a really interesting node of how people perceive curtness as maybe rudeness. And there's an aspect of the relationship you already have with someone, is a good foundation. You can almost afford to be more curt and to keep that kind of harmony amongst your team. How would you go about, like, what are the kind of tips the type of communication style you would hope to see in that environment?
Yeah, that's a good point. That sometimes there is a certain efficiency with closeness and trust that, can be accelerated. Maybe assuming that it is kind of a tense work environment, how to maybe rectify that. I think just brief explanations can go a long way. Surgeon being frustrated that the OR isn't prepped on time is not a great way to start a 2-3 hour surgery. But maybe if he or she finds out why that OR is not prepped in time, can kind of lower the temperature. Even giving that OR staff the ability to communicate, hey, this is why. Whys go a long way, right? There's excuses and then there's reasons. And excuses tend to come from personal deficiencies, right? Laziness, whatever, right? The reason, though, is exactly that. There's a list of things that occurred that resulted in X. And so just the excuses versus reasons, I think, is a good model to take forward just in communication. I would say that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I do find that it's like the understanding the why is really important, even in something simple as like how we interact. If you were to ever be curt, because I know the why of like the mission you're on, how you see it, see it as like maybe someone needs something in the coaching realm or some data or whatever, like that makes it completely different, or sets the stage different. So anyways, just wanted to say thank you for your time and appreciate your service as always and your support of our mission.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.